demos who were founded just 3 or 4 months ago, and they got 5 million votes in Spain, which means 8%, which means 4 or 5 seats in the European Parliament. And it is not a surprise that this party is very well connected with Syriza and with Alexis Tsipras. On the other hand, in Slovenia, I wouldn't say they are a complete failure. You had the Initiative for Democratic Socialism, a very young party, founded also 3 or 4 months ago, backed also by Alexis Tsipras, who was there in Ljubljana at the founding congress, and they got almost 6% at the elections. Okay, they didn't get any seats in the European Parliament, but if tomorrow we had national elections in Slovenia, they would get 6 seats in the national parliament. The list of the other, Italy, in Italy got 3 seats in the parliament, a Bulgarian citizen, a famous trade unionist got 1 seat, also she was on the list of Alexis Tsipras, and so on. So what I claim is that the left is again threatening the idea of the liberal democracy, the idea of the end of history, the idea that austerity measures can bring growth, can bring wealth, and so on. And I think it's a remarkable scenario. Regarding the thesis that we need more free market, if I got you right, that actually we need less regulation and more free market, I think it is precisely, and I'm jumping now from Francis Fukuyama, but it's a logical step, because I think we cannot mention Fukuyama and not mentioning Yugoslavia. I think precisely the last 25 years in this region, in the Balkans, show that this thesis that we need more free market is very dangerous. I won't go into statistics and into numbers, but we should mention some numbers. During the beginning of the war in this area, the external debt of Yugoslavia was around 9.5 billion euro. The external debt of all countries together today, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and so on, is 107 billion euros. And this is the direct consequence of the interventions from the 80s, of several loans taken by taken from the IMF and so on. Of course, I would agree with someone, I don't know who was it at the panel yesterday, who claimed that the Yugoslavian crisis already started at the 70s. I would go even a bit further. At the beginning of Yugoslavia, you have Boris Kidrić, who says in the 50s that the biggest problem of Yugoslavia, of social self-management, is that it is going into the direction of monopoly capitalism of the Soviet Union, which is very interesting. 71, you have Vladimir Bakarić, who says the biggest problem of Yugoslavian self-management is that the extra value is not going back to the workers, but is going to a financial elite, which is becoming which is getting a complete autonomy. So what you have in Yugoslavia already at the 70s, and the crisis of the 70s is something what we will have again in 2008, when the financial elites got a complete autonomy. Why I mention this? Because I think it is important to mention that actually economy was one of the main reasons, and exactly the ideology of free market for the collapse of Yugoslavia. The prevailing thesis today is still that the main reason for the collapse of Yugoslavia was nationalism. There was hatred among all our countries and so on, and then we had the war, and you know all this story. But if we look at the numbers again, if we look at the loans, one of the biggest IMF loans in history until that date was given to Yugoslavia just a few months after the death of Tito, for example. That's very interesting. If you look at the numbers of worker strikes, and I suggest you to read a very interesting PhD dissertation by Jake Lowinger, who made his PhD dissertation under Giovanni Arrighi, where he was here in Yugoslavia for several years investigating worker strikes during the 80s, and he gives the numbers. And what you see there is really shocking. From the 80s until 88, each year the number of worker strikes is rising. On the one hand, what this shows is that Yugoslavia wasn't really a totalitarian system. In '87, you had 16,000 worker strikes in Yugoslavia. And this is really remarkable. It's more than 200,000 people. So can you imagine the European Union today with around 20,000 worker strikes? It would probably collapse at the same moment. If it wouldn't collapse, what would be the next step? It would be social tensions, probably. And this is exactly what happened in Yugoslavia. Those who are older probably remember much better the famous worker strike in Labin, the famous worker strikes in Vukovar, Borovo Naselje, and so on. And what you had there, or in Tuzla, for example, where you had again the protest, which is, I think, a direct link. What you had there is that you always had Serbs, Croatians, Bosniaks striking together. So it wasn't a nationalist movement, it was actually an anti-nationalist movement. And then you have, of course, '89, and then you have '91. And my claim, I cannot go into detail now, but I hope maybe in the discussion, my claim is that actually this led to the collapse of Yugoslavia, in a way. By saying this, I'm not saying that we don't have examples of hatred, of some sort of evil which is not explainable by economy or by philosophy or by whatever, but I just claim we have to take this into consideration. And I will end by my last example, which brings us to the recent developments in this region. And these are the floods. And my claim is that exactly the floods which happened in Bosnia, in one smaller part of Croatia, and in one bigger part in Serbia, reaching even to Belgrade, is a best proof that the ideology of free market is not functioning, on the one hand. On the other hand, that the state is not functioning as well. Why? I mean, you are probably familiar with the floods. You know that the territory flooded in Bosnia is the same size as the state of Israel, for example, or the state of Kuwait. The costs of all these damages done by the floods in Bosnia will amount 10% of the GDP. It's more than 1 billion euros. So again, Bosnia will be the one who will be fucked up in this region again. What is happening now, of course, is that IMF is coming, and Jeffrey Sachs, this famous guy who was responsible for the liberal democracy in the Balkans and for the prosperity and stability and peace, was a few days ago in Belgrade again, negotiating new loans, asking for new reforms, of course. But why I'm claiming that the free market ideology was one of the reasons for the catastrophe. We should look back at history, of course. I mean, there is the famous quote by Hegel who says, the only lesson we learned from history is that we didn't learn anything from history. And but we should look back to Hurricane Katrina, for example, when the Scottish geographer Neil Smith claimed there is no such thing as a natural catastrophe. And he showed how exactly the policies of George Bush Jr., free market policies, rational policies in New Orleans brought to the disastrous effects which happened in New Orleans. So it wasn't just a natural disaster. The same goes for Haiti in 2010, where exactly the period, the historical period of colonialism brought to such degrees of disaster. And I would claim the Balkans is just another part in this historical sequence. Why? Just after the floods, you had more and more information why the effects were so disastrous. One of the reasons was, of course, the privatization of water public companies. For example, in Serbia, most of the public companies are privatized. In the period of the last 10 years, more than 2,500 public companies, not only water supplies, are privatized. By the end of the 80s, The plan was to build 35 dams in whole Serbia. You know what is the number built until today? 5. Why? Because the state is not investing into public companies anymore, because this is not important anymore. So much about the ideology of security and so on. And if you think this is only a perspective, you know, of a radical leftist, let me quote a guy from the World Bank. A guy from the World Bank called Holger Krey, who is responsible for not only for Eastern Europe but also from Asia and for public companies governing and trying to give safety in situations like floods, said a few weeks ago that Yugoslavia had the best system of preventing floods. And why did this system fail? Because of privatizing those companies and because letting them to the terrain of a free market. You have examples all around ex-Yugoslavia why this happened. Of course, proponents of free market would say, yeah, but corruption is a reason, and in Croatia you had guys who were really stealing, you know, swords from the dams and so on. But what you have here is actually the fulfillment of the thesis of, and by this I will end, because I think this is the future on the one hand, and this is already happening, and it is in a clear parallel with this trend of China, is a fulfillment of the prophecy of the Dutch king Willem Alexander. You know, this king gave a TV interview a few months ago, I think it was last year actually already, where he said the welfare state is dead. The welfare state, as we knew it in the 20th century, died. What we have instead is something he called participation society. And he said, if you want healthcare, if you want education, if you want all that was public before, you will have to invest. Because, you know, this is a sort of a perverse Sartrean thesis, I would say, when Sartre in existentialism, his humanism said every man or every woman is his own project. But of course he was aiming at existentialism and philosophy. What we have today is that the proponents of free market claim exactly the same. And what we had in the floods, during the floods in the Balkans, is exactly the fulfillment of this prophecy. There is no welfare state anymore. The state is not doing the job of security, safety, healthcare, education, and so on. But what we have instead is that people have to organize themselves. What we've seen in the Balkans is, of course, something beautiful, that we, again, for the first time after the collapse of Yugoslavia, we had this rise of solidarity among different nations, people from Zagreb sending goods to Serbia, people from Serbia helping people in Bosnia and so on. And this is really beautiful, but this is at the same time the problem. Because on the one hand, it shows, as I tried to show, that the ideology of free market, on the one hand, brought to the privatization of public companies and public goods. On the other hand, that we really in the Balkans have failed states. And then you have the famous tennis player Djokovic, who is giving €500,000 to the people, or you have Emir Kusturica, who is sending private helicopters. This is the job of the state. So what I am claiming is that the state is not doing this anymore. And what is interesting, but okay, I'll have to end. What is interesting now today is that China, in some parts, for example in Chongqing, our comrade from China will know this, who was in China will know this much better, is doing experiments with welfare state. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Boji Lao is spending his time in prison. I had the opportunity to be in Chongqing, and what was there, it's remarkable. They are subsidizing flats for poor migrants who are coming from China. Poor migrants get citizenship when they come to Chongqing. Why? Of course, here I must be cynical, because Foxconn moved from Shenzhen to Chongqing, and this is a way for attracting foreign capital, of course. But what we have today is that some states, which are authoritarian states, authoritarian capitalist states, are rethinking the model again, I would say. On the other hand, Europe is completely dismissing the model of welfare state, of a state that needs to provide healthcare, security, free education, and so on. And I think we will have even more catastrophes, especially in the Balkans, exactly because of this ideology. I will end here. It was a lot of steps, but I hope in the discussion we can go into the depth of it.
All right, thank you, Srečko, for this very comprehensive overview. I've got many comments, but maybe I'll keep them for later. In terms of the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the culturalist perspective, claiming that it was the nationalism and the savageness in the Balkan subject, there's the great work done by Susan Woodward, we mentioned yesterday, who's taking this materialist perspective, arguing that the role of IMF and the capitalist dynamic were pretty much effective in steering nationalism in the 80s in Yugoslavia, which was, as an account, was very much sidelined, at least so far. I like the way you dismantled Francis Fukuyama, whose End of History perhaps cemented the notion of centrist liberalism, but also it paved the way for the conservative revolution we have now, which is also a very important aspect. Of course, the left itself had a great role in supporting this concept by dismantling the core left-wing values such as welfare, such as socialism, and by being complicit with this thesis of radical centrism by Giddens and Ulrich Beck, which is crap, And then, therefore, today we have very, very weak, or perhaps, as we mentioned, upcoming left, but still the dominance is in the center-right. No, that is my view. As to the regulations and capitalism, I'm very curious what will Slaviša say about it, because as you claim, the regulations, they are regulations, but they're mostly in favor of the corporate capital. And what, Slaviša, I hope you can give us your perspective on that after we finish with all with the speakers. And then I will turn to Professor Salecl by pointing to, again, to Fukuyama's concept of post-human future, where he tackled some values of human subjectivity, which are, decaying in the context of liberal ideology. Can you please kindly share your thoughts with us related to your concept of the end of the future, as you mentioned to me? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my first time in Macedonia, and I'm very much enjoying my time here. Just a brief comment to one of the things that Srečko said, the fact that we had so many worker strikes in the 80s. It's kind of interesting to look at this with sort of Milosevic ideology. Isn't it funny that we needed a banker to stop workers' strikes and sort of channel them into nationalist fights? So he was kind of definitely before our times. I'm sure that in some way maybe bankers are, kind of enjoying at least the turn to nationalism in Europe and elsewhere. That they will definitely, get various types of profits out of it. Now, when we are sort of speaking about crisis, quite often, the sort of issue throughout history is a kind of a normal part of history that we have progress or crisis. And in some way, we have sort of kind of go from one to the other. On the one hand, we still live in the illusion of progress. Progress and development are still one of the sort of two most used words, at least by the politicians. And on the other hand, we have definitely more and more kind of an understanding that we are going from one crisis to the other, and that pretty much crisis is kind of the ultimate form of being of capitalism that we live in. Now, of course, we have debated in the last years also whether there is possibility to envision the end of capitalism, and there have been sort of sayings that we can envision the end of the world, but not the end of sort of capitalism as we know it. Now, coupled with this perceptions is also more and more a feeling that people are somehow kind of almost like in a frozen state. Now we even see people frozen in the way that they cannot even move or they don't go to vote. We have seen, you know, an enormously kind of passive response to European elections just recently, and even with other elections. Today in Slovenia we have a referendum about the past, what to do with our, you know, archives, especially archives where there is stored information about the collaborations with the communist secret police. And, you know, today probably the result of these elections will be that people will absolutely be in their passive state, which means that passivity, not doing anything, now more and more also appears to be a new form of protests. And why not? Now, what I want to tackle a little bit is what kind of a sort of a perception of future we are embracing today. And we have heard debates about risk, and, you know, we can say that in the domain of economy, for a long time we have this obsession with the future, with the idea that we can find ways to predict and forecast where an economy will be going. Now, just before the crisis of 2008, we had such a belief in computer programs which can predict especially the investments. One of the most famous programs was called VAR, Value at Risk, and it was used by most banks, financial institutions. And the idea of this program was that it was 99% accurate. Now, as soon as someone says to you that something is 99% accurate, you should always think about that 1%. Now, in regard to this program, the fact was that this was created only using data of the time of progress. You know, it didn't go far enough with collecting data of economic development, investments, and so on, to include, you know, the previous crisis, especially in the crisis in the late 20s. And, you know, it did not even imagine a kind of, let's say, a total collapse of the financial market that we briefly experienced in 2008. Now, the perception of risk is part of all dimensions of our life, and we are trying to envision, you know, kind of a future where we can sort of predict and forecast things that very much affect us, especially our mortality, our biology, so we are trying to figure out our offspring. We are obsessing with neuroscience, genetic research, which are the top sort of researchers, which are sort of kind of opening a new idea of the future. Now, on the one hand, we can say that every society have been obsessing with this idea of what kind of a future we are going into, and also pretty much even societies before ours were obsessing how can we sort of look into the heads of other people. But today our idea is that science is kind of opening up new ways, which is why, especially in the domain of criminology, now we have huge studies into how we can predict who will be a future danger individual. We even have neuroscience going into the elections. We are trying to predict with the help of neuroscience who might vote in which direction, or we are using genetics to figure out whether people are maybe genetically predisposed to be, you know, right-wingers or left-wingers. These are like the most sort of published books in the domain of sort of, let's say, new futurology. Now, even the way we are kind of ensuring ourselves in regard to the future, it's interesting to see some kind of ideological changes. In the past, people were buying insurance so that they can get money to pay for their burial, to get, you know, sort of money for you know, sort of putting the corpse underground. Now, today, we are sort of buying insurance to kind of keep the corpse, the living corpse, an old body, diseased body alive. So we are trying to insure ourselves for all kinds of catastrophes, and if we presumably have an illness, a particular kind of illness that might not be, you know, sort of the one that will kill us quickly, we won't get insurance, which is why insurance is they're very much interested in genetic analysis or sort of neuroscience speculations about how long a person might live. So the change, what is happening today is in some way we are obsessing with prediction, forecasting, and more we are also in a strange way embracing some kind of a denial. And here there are varieties of denials that I can observe. On the one hand, we have more and more denial as very much part of political discourse. There is, politicians usually are incredibly skilled in sort of denials or playing with words that tend to help them to deny. In the past, already Orwell pointed out that we have to be very careful to listen to which words politicians are using, and especially when they speak about justice, freedom, equality, and so on. We have to imagine that these are tools that help, sort of to cover something, to kind of, let's say, cover a truth that we don't want to face. And people who have researched speeches of Hitler saw that, just before World War II, he was using the words peace and freedom the most often in his speeches. Now, we today are speaking quite often about progress and development, of course, again, with, an intention to kind of, let's say, cover other ideological battles that are going behind that. Now, paradoxically, in our desire to control individual future, we have more and more people who are denying death. There is a growing movement of so-called immortalists. Now, this movement believes that if we have positive thinking, we might not die. Now, the idea of this movement, and if you look online, you will see that they seem to be, quite strong movement. Their idea is that death is a choice. So, if there is a possibility to master death with positive thinking. Now, they also have a really interesting answer when someone of them dies. Usually the theory is that in the last weeks we could see that the person didn't have any more such strong positive thoughts and that the person had doubts, which is why, unfortunately, he died. Now, the idea of positive thinking is unfortunately part of our daily discourse. We are bombarded as individuals to think positively, to kind of have the idea of choice in all dimensions of our lives. So it appears that, and even, in Slovenia, just recently with our intermediate government of the first woman, Alenka Bratušek, the main idea of her discourse always was, we have to think positively. The previous government was negative, we need to think positive. So a certain kind of enjoyment in a common delusion seems to be, I think, kind of, let's say, a unifying form in today's society. Now, in conclusion, let me point out what kind of the idea of the future do we have really today. Quite often, as I mentioned, we can observe many forms of denial as part of our perception of future. We are sort of denying aging, we are denying death, we are sort of have a lot of sort of denial, even with the way we try to sort of change our bodies. More and more women are having even frozen faces. I was starting with the idea that we live in frozen times where a lot of people seem unable to vote or don't want to vote, are incredibly passive. But it appears that visually, to have a lot of Botox in your face, makes you a perfect kind of a body for these frozen times. A lot of people, paradoxically, are also psychologically frozen. Now, in the ideology of choice, where people have the perception that everything in their life, the direction of their life, their health, body, how their children will turn out, love, and so on, is a matter of choice, psychoanalysts are seeing that more and more people can't choose anything, which means that they are kind of frozen. They are always researching what might be an ideal choice or what might be choice that will bring them an ideal, like happiness, contentment, because they are constantly afraid. They want to insure themselves from failure, from loss, from disappointment, they choose nothing. It appears sometimes even in politics, like in Slovenia today, we have so many parties on the left, you know, many small parties emerging daily, but people can't make any choice, which is why they are either frozen, they can't choose, or quite often when we are, you know, in the grips of anxiety, we choose a leader who appears not